Sorry, I was muted. Uh, Hello, welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us for today's Preservation School on block printed wallpaper. Our upcoming programming includes our 2025 Six to Celebrate launch party that is tonight. Tickets are still available for a few more hours, so check out our website if you want to come tonight. It's at the Stonewall Inn. And then on May 3rd, we have, so this Saturday, a tour of Little Syria. And on May 31st, we have the rain date of the scavenger hunt for downtown Brooklyn. Information about all of our upcoming programming can be found on our website, hdc.org. If you have any questions about programming, you can contact me at marbulu@hdc.org. Today's class will be recorded and posted to our YouTube channel for free viewing. You may also watch all of our previous Preservation School classes, virtual tours, and conference panels on our YouTube channel. I would like to thank the New York State Department of Cultural Affairs, City Council, and the New York State Council on the Arts for supporting Preservation School. If you have any questions, you can add them to the chat and they will be addressed at the end. Now I'll hand it over to Michele to lead tonight's class. Thank you. I think you're muted.
Thank you. Hello, and thanks to Michele and the Historic Districts Council for inviting me to talk about Adelphi's 26-year foray into experimenting with the techniques and materials used by wallpaper manufacturers of the 18th and 19th century. I've been making hand block printed wallpapers at Adelphi Wallpaper Hangings for the past 25 years. And as you'll soon see, the technology that we use to make our papers on a daily basis is well over 100 years old, 200, 300. And so I hope you'll forgive me if I struggle with our current technology of computers, Zoom screens, and slide presentations. Next slide. I'd like to start first by telling you a little bit about the history of wall coverings and block printed wallpapers. Then I'll give an overview of the company's 26-year history and processes that we use to make historically accurate reproductions. Throughout, I'll talk a little bit about some of the projects that we have been involved with and how we work with historic homes, museums, and institutions when wallpaper is called for as part of their preservation and restoration work. I put in the chat a bibliography of some of the most well-worn books that we have in our small library at the shop and ones that I used in putting together this presentation. This is a good time to stress that I'm not a wallpaper historian, but there are a handful of exceptional ones, and we're very grateful that so many of them have been generous with their expertise. And with that, let's start at the very beginning of the tradition of hand hanging printed paper to adorn walls in Europe. The earliest printed paper hangings evolved from decorative paper sheets that were intended for books, drawers, and trunks. Here's an example of that. The next slide. These papers, called lining papers or domino papers in France, were most often printed in black ink on unstained paper and then often hand colored with washes on top of the print. Next slide. It's hard to pin down exactly when people began nailing or pasting or tacking these sheets to the wall, but certainly there were instances of its use on ceilings in Renaissance interiors in the late 16th century. Between that time and 1650, the historical record shows a few examples of these paper sheets being applied to the walls. Next slide. After 1650, many more examples have been documented, and it's clear that its use for wall decoration was well established in England and France by the end of the 1600s. Next slide. It's also at this time that European manufacturers started to join sheets together end to end before printing on them. Many historians attribute this change to as arising from contact with China, where had long been a tradition of using decorative paper on the walls and interiors. By the beginning of the 18th century, we start to see paper hangings produced on glued together rolls with the sole purpose of decorating walls, and wallpaper, as we think of it, is born. I'll spend more time later talking about the process, including the gluing together of sheets, but I want to touch briefly on the early methods for producing wall hangings. Next slide. In the next two slides, we'll show portions of the pen, ink, and wash drawings that were intended as engravings to document the process for Diderot's Encyclopédie. The drawings were made by Jean-Michel Papillon, who was perhaps the best known and most successful wallpaper manufacturer in France at the beginning of the mid-18th century. These three illustrations show how paper sheets were prepared, the woodblock positioned on a sturdy bench, and how the paints were mixed and large inking pads were prepared using pieces of leather atop a stuffing. Next slide. These three illustrations show how sheets were printed, the inking pads of the pads and ensuring an even coat, placing the paper sheets on top of the blocks, and pressing with a roller to make contact, removing the paper and hanging each sheet to dry. Altogether, Papillon documented the process from tools to finished product hung in a room with a set of 27 illustrations. But apparently Diderot felt this was just a little bit too thorough, and they were never included in the encyclopedia. Slide 9. At some point between the printing of individual sheets and the printing of pre-joined rolls, the process becomes reversed, where the paper is now placed on the bench and the wood blocks are applied on top to achieve the print. Smaller blocks, such as in this picture, didn't require a lot of pressure, so the printer would hit the block with the mallet or just use hand pressure to make the impression. Next slide. Over the next century and a half, the process itself doesn't change a lot, though there's a trend toward patterns that require larger blocks, more colors, and greater precision of the registration. Larger blocks require more pressure. So as you can see in this slide, the printer is making use of a long bar for leverage to press down and make the paint. Next slide. In this image, the pressure is transferred to the block using a foot pedal, which allowed for even greater pressure to be applied. We'll revisit this image and the process more later, but now I thought I would really breeze through the topic of wallpaper pattern styles and fashion over time. The popularity of wallpaper styles varied from region to region and over time, and also as an effect of improvements to printing technology and the availability of pigments. The sheer number and styles and trends and ideas about how to decorate our walls that proliferated during that time is incredible, and we are fortunate to have as many well-preserved documents as we do. They're in the collections of in France at the Musée de Papier Peint and at the Musée des Arts Décoratifs, at the Victoria and Albert Museum in England, the Cooper Hewitt, and the Library of Congress in the United States, as well as collections with Historic New England, the RISD Museum, and many other small museums worldwide. So what I can show you today is really just a smattering and doesn't begin to touch the topic. Next slide. But by far the biggest influence on wallpaper design was textile design. Next. In England, many of these early designs were in emulation of silk damasks and cut velvets, and often these patterns were flocked, which was achieved by printing with a sticky varnish and applying chopped wool to the surface. This is a flocked damask. Here, the next two slides. That's another damask, and then the next two slides. In France, as well as in England, we also see imitations of lace work and embroidered chintzes. This one, I think, is sort of a combination of the two with some lacy white prints. And then the next three slides, at the beginning of the 19th century, patterns that give the illusion of hung draperies also become common, and the borders often took inspiration from tassels and trims. So this is an chintz. And the next slide. Here's another one, stenciled, very early paper, mid-1700s, that looks like crewel work. Next slide. And then here's one slightly later, imitating a stylized imitation of drapery. Next slide. Stripes, small geometrics, and simple sprigs and florals were also quite popular across time and regions, and comprise most of our patterns in the collection today, our most popular patterns. Okay, so next slide. Here's a stripe from Denmark, late 1700s. Next. This is one of our most popular patterns, a small geometric. Next. Larger geometric, but still in this category. Next slide, and the next slide. Okay, there's a sprig that's installed at Mount Vernon. So next slide. This is the architectural papers. Were very common and popular. They were meant to imitate cut stone, marble, or plaster work. And there were also many neoclassical motifs and borders taking inspiration from Greek and Roman temple decoration. So here's an ashlar paper. The next slide is also an ashlar paper. And then, and ashlars were often put in hallways, in part to bring the outside in. There was a fashion for that, and in part because when you put them in halls and stairways, they're easy to replace just one single ashlar if something were damaged for heavy use areas. The next two slides will show, or the next three slides will show coffered ceiling, so imitations of plasterwork or coffered wood. Okay, should be at slide 35. In France, the arabesque style was popular for decades. We see figures, fruit, birds, urns, vases with flowers or small vignettes piled on top of one another and linked together with flower garlands, ribbons, or strings of pearls. And this is these architectural, or sorry, this sort of takes the idea of an architectural paper like one step further. You can think of these as sort of fantastical architectures in the sky. Next slide, slide 37. In England, oh, sorry, next slide. I guess and the next. Okay, now we're at pillars and arches. Um, these this type of pattern was popular in England. It's called a pillar and arch. They're usually large scale patterns that alternate stone pillars and archways and often house allegorical figures, urns, or statuaries. The next slide. This is also a pillar and arch. It's an early American one that depicts a colonist handing the Declaration of Independence to Britannia. Slide 38 and then slide 39. Towards the end of block printing's heyday, these architectures in the sky take on a Gothic influence, and designers create patterns in emulation of cathedrals. Next slide. The next 3 slides, I believe, are all Gothic patterns. And then we'll be to slide 43. And of course, there were many more styles and categories, including richly detailed overdoors, such as this one, and scenics, such as the next two, which required hundreds of blocks and colors and hours of labor to create elaborate room wrapping murals. Slide 46. In America, all of these papers were readily being exported to the colonies and were available to colonists who had enough money to afford them. And indeed, we know from the historical record that many of our nation's forefathers ordered papers from both England and France for homes, such as Monticello, Mount Vernon, and James Madison, Montpelier. But the export of paper hangings was subject to a hefty excise tax of 30%, and in part as a reaction to that, and in part just because it was bound to happen, wallpaper manufacturers started operating in the colonies by 1756. That's the earliest record that we have, and it's from a newspaper advertisement in the New York Mercury, specifying that John Hickey, in addition to dyeing, cleansing, and printing textiles, also stamps or prints paper in the English manner and hangs it so as to harbor no worms. Slide 47 through 49. Philadelphia and Boston also had wallpaper manufacturing. What we find with early American papers is that in general, they were much more crude in terms of design and execution than those printed in Europe. Designs were sometimes copied from French and English papers. Patterns were in general more simple, paints were not as refined, and often the registration was not at all exact. In the next 3 slides. But they were a more economical choice, and by the end of the block printing era, in the mid-1800s, American manufacturers had made up a lot of ground, and some manufacturers were competitive in terms of quality. Around 1840, roller printing technology was developed, and by 1880, it had all but replaced block printed paper hangings. With machine printed papers, multiple colors could be applied all at once. Production was much faster and less labor intensive. Thinner paper and less expensive inks could be used, and as a result, wallpaper became a much more affordable and available to most homes, and its production greatly increased. And while the tradition of block printing was eclipsed by the advent of roller printing, it did not die out completely and was still used for high-end manufacturing in England, France, and Germany, among other places. The papers of William Morris and others participating in the arts and crafts movement were still printed by hand, as well as some Art Deco designs stemming from the Bauhaus movement in Germany. And in fact, the orange pattern on the wall on the screen behind me is one such example. Slide 53. So now we'll really skip ahead to the end of the 20th century and the beginning of our company. This is the current location of our company in Sharon Springs. Slide 54. It's the interior, it's a little blurry. And then the next slide, please. Adelphi began out of the interest of Chris Orstrom, on your right, one of the co-founders of the business. Chris, who had a passion for historic restoration, was living in Cooperstown, New York at the time, and one day decided to poke his head into an abandoned federal period house that he came across in the region. He wasn't looking for anything in particular, but found a piece of scenic wallpaper installed in the house that piqued his interest, and he started to learn what he could about block printed wallpaper production. I should also say that at the time, Chris had a small paint company that specialized in recreating historic oil paint colors called Williamsburg Paint. Chris's interest, especially his interest in exploring the process that was behind the creation of historic wallpapers, led to a workshop at Eastfield Village and eventually to setting up a block printed wallpaper demonstration program at the Farmers Museum in Cooperstown, New York in 1996. Steve Larson, on the left, our other co-founder, had an interest in the historic trades and had recently moved to the area from New York City to build a timber frame house by hand. Steve, an artist who studied ceramics at the University of Washington in Seattle, often incorporated vintage wallpapers into his paper mache sculpture. By chance, Steve visited the Farmers Museum, saw the beginnings of the American paper staining manufactory, joined the project when a job opening occurred, and set out to learn and revive the craft of block printing wallpapers. After about 2 years of dogged experimentation, Chris and Steve realized that there was enough demand for historic wallpaper reproductions to make a business, and in 1999 launched Adelphi Paper Hangings. The basic concept behind the business has been to recreate historic designs, being as faithful as feasible to the historic methods and techniques that were employed 200 years ago, and creating a high quality, accurate reproduction. Slide 56, we'll skip. That was a small video, but isn't working so well. The video is meant to take us on an overview of the whole process, and then the rest will be a details of the process. So this is me drafting a wallpaper design. So whether we choose a historic design to add to our line or approached by a historic home or museum to reproduce a specific design, the process begins with drafting new patterns to be the basis of new printing blocks. Next slide. Ideally, we can work from an original sample in good condition, as is the case in this photo. So in this photo, we have an example of a French paper that had never been hung on the wall. So it's in good condition and it has not been stretched or warped. This is our ideal situation. Next slide. But often we work from photographs and from originals in poor condition, and sometimes even from incomplete pattern fabrics. So I put this slide up here. This Jen, one of the employees here, my colleague, is currently working on or just finished up this reproduction of a border. And as you can see, she didn't have a lot to go by. And so on the slide on the right, you can see the up above, was all her interpretation of what would fill up the space there. Next slide. Oh, and I forgot to say that she was, that slide was for the Tipton Haynes house in Tennessee. And then we skipped a Mount Vernon fragment, and then we are on to these two examples of how we have received papers. So sometimes the condition of the paper is beyond poor. On the left, these fragments of a medallion paper were taken off boards. But it turns out that in that pile there, we could piece together the entire pattern and know exactly what was there, and we didn't need to do any interpreting on our own. On the right, we received in the mail a box of plaster chunks with wallpaper on it. Apparently, the contractor didn't get the message that the wallpaper was going to be reproduced, and they started demolition. But we were luckily able, from the pieces in the box, able to figure out the pattern. And so what's underneath those plaster chunks is our finished product. Next slide. This is an example of the tracing in progress. This is a sprig that we did. We were commissioned by Mount Vernon. This one went in the Lafayette room, something we call fancy sprig. Next slide. So every transparency that we hand draw on acetate corresponds to a block that will be laser cut. So I offset the two so you can see the transparency and then the block underneath. The patterns, the transparencies that we hand draw are scanned, and then the blocks are laser cut. We send those out. So traditionally those would have been hand carved. But what Steve likes to say is that if we did the hand carving ourselves, we'd just still be on our 10th pattern. And we have well over 100. So the blocks are made from a plywood backing that has cherry laminated to the top, and the carving goes, or the laser cutting is into the cherry. For a while we used Swiss pear, which is the traditional material. Swiss pear is excellent because it has a very fine grain, and it's very, very dense, so it holds the details well. We're finding cherry to be a pretty good substitute. We stopped using Swiss pear because it became very hard to find quality boards, and also kept increasing in price. Next slide. After the blocks have been laser cut, we do some routering and some hand chiseling to remove some of the wood in the larger open areas of the pattern so that they don't pick up paint. And so this is Jack chiseling away some of the plywood parts of our block. But you can see pretty clearly in this photo the difference between the cherry on the top. I think that looks like it was cherry. Next slide. These are a couple of well-worn blocks. so you can see after their use. And then the next two slides show the more blocks that have the ink on them ready to print. And then the next slide. Repairs are sometimes necessary, especially if the block has a lot of fine details, like such as this one with these tiny little stripes. So I think you can see we will replace with brass, or lately we've been 3D printing some pieces of replacements, which is working out really well. And actually, we've been experimenting with 3D printing for the full blocks, especially if it's a pattern that we don't think we'll be adding to our line. And so far, they seem to be holding up pretty well. The next slide. So now we've got our blocks and made and ready to go. The next step is the paper. So we get our paper from France, from the company Arches, and it's a 70% cotton rag paper, which works. We hear a lot from paper hangers. They really like our paper. It takes the paste really well. It becomes quite flexible when pasted, and it's very similar to the papers that were used to make wallpapers in the 17th and 18th and 19th century. Let's see, the next slide is a video, but we won't watch that. The video shows Steve cutting the paper. When we work with a museum or historic home, oftentimes we will make seamed rolls rather than using continuous rolls, which is what we usually do for our private clients. Generally don't want the seams, but when people want the paper to be as accurate as possible, a reproduction, they'll call for seamed rolls. And the reason that rolls were seamed was because the technology didn't exist for making paper rolls. Each sheet was handmade, so they were glued together. Next slide.
Do you want me to try to play the video?
You could try to play it. It's I just found it to be humorous. It shows Steve cutting the paper, and then 10 feet away it shows me gluing it back together. So we could try
No,
it.
let's see what happens.
Okay. Okay, I'm not seeing the video play.
Yeah, I'm not getting a play
Okay.
option, so I guess never mind.
That's okay. Yeah, so in that video, Steve is cutting the paper and then I'm gluing it back together. But in this image, we have Hannah seaming our rolls for us. So what we use for glue was what was used traditionally. It's a rabbit skin glue, an animal hide glue. So it's a gel or almost solid at room temperature. So it needs to be heated up in the glue pot and then applied. And then once we paste up about 10 sheets at once, we need 21 sheets to make a roll. So once we get that glue on there, we need to work fast. The next two images just show Hannah putting joining the sheets with a roller. And so whether we do them on continuous paper or whether we have seamed paper, our rolls are 11 yards long. So we have an 11-yard table in our shop. And after they're seamed, or we put the background color on by hand. And this shows Jen putting on a gray background color. And this process is called grounding. So in the next slide, just a close-up of the brushes that we use. In the center, you can see a 2-knot brush. That was the brush traditionally used in the wallpaper printing process. We used 2-knot brushes for a while for grounding and printing, but they became a little bit harder to get, and we were wearing through them so quickly that we stopped using them for grounding, and now we just use a hardware store variety floor staining brush for our grounding, and that's the ones on either side of that 2-knot brush. We still use the 2-knot brush when we're printing to brush out our felts. Next slide. Occasionally, especially if we're doing a dark color, we'll need to use a circle brush to do our grounding, and that requires 2 people. One person puts the paint on and the other person rubs the paint in a circle so as to make no marks or streaks. The thing about our process is we always have to keep a wet edge, so once we get started, we can't stop until a roll is complete. Next slide. Here's Hannah hanging up a roll. This is actually trickier than it looks, and because that's a 11 yards of wet paper that needs to get hung up. We've all dropped them on the floor. Next slide. And this is them hanging to dry. We put little hanger sticks at the end so the paper doesn't curl up. Next slide. The paint that we use for grounding and printing is all made at the shop. It's a traditional distemper paint. Distemper being an English bastardization of the French word that I can't pronounce. That means to soak. It has a very matte surface. Next slide. And in this picture, Steve is mixing up the bases that we use to make our paint. So as with a distemper paint, the bases are made of chalk, clay, water, and a binder that would stick it together. So traditionally, that binder was rabbit skin glue. Again, we have switched to an acrylic binder, which doesn't look any different, but makes the paper much easier to hang. The rabbit skin glue binder wasn't nearly as strong for one, and for two, it's water soluble. So once you put the paste on the back, it was very difficult for it to not bleed through. You had to get your working time exactly right, and we thought we'd give paper hangers a break. So we use an acrylic binder from Golden Artist Colors. The next slide. So we have our bases. We add pigments to match and recreate historic colors. We've got Steve weighing out pigments. Every color has a formula. Next slide. And since we make each of our papers to order, we don't keep a stock supply. Every time we mix up paint, we need to test the color to make sure it's matches to the original. So on the left, we have our formula, which also changes slightly as we go along. Our pigment companies have changed, and so it's a guide. It's generally not exactly right each time. So we test each paint that we make against our original. Next slide. To make sure that we're as close as possible. That's Steve testing. Next slide. This is where we store all of our paint formulas. And each of our patterns, so we have well over 100 patterns, is offered in, and they have multiple colors per pattern, is we have 4 colorways per pattern as well. So thousands and thousands of paint color formulas. So in a little bit about our colorways, the A colorway in our line is always the historic document colorway. And the B colorway is always historically feasible. So using pigments that were available at the time and color combinations that we've seen a record of and were seen in sort of, I guess, a record of in that same style. Then the C colorways and the D colorways are pretty much anywhere, anything goes. Oftentimes we'll try to think of a muted colorway and then maybe a very fun colorway. We can also custom color to any paint chip. So designers will often specify they want a certain pattern, but they want to use different colors. They'll send us a paint chip and we'll match to that. Next colorway, or sorry, next slide. So I showed this slide earlier in our presentation. I put it back in just so before we get to the part about printing, I just want to refresh your memory about what things looked like in the late 1700s. And next slide, what they look like now. So this is me doing the first step of the process of the actual printing. I'm loading the felt that's placed in the sieve with paint. So under the stretcher that you can see, I have a piece of acrylic felt. Originally that would have been wool felt. Acrylic felt that is getting charged with paint and creating like a giant stamp pad. And under the felt is a waterproof membrane that floats on top of water. And then that all together makes a surface that can make good contact and get paint on all parts of the block. So next slide. So Jack's got his felt all charged and ready, and so now he's tamping his block into the felt to pick up paint. Next slide. And then the next step is to place it onto the paper, which sits on top of the bench. Next slide. So we have an Instagram account, and Jessica makes a process videos that show us printing. We have multiple videos there. And the question that we get most often is, how do you line it up? Because it looks like magic, but it's not magic. And so I put this slide in to show Jen. She, in this picture, has her index finger is pointing, and then her pinky finger, if you follow those two together, you can see it's pointing to a pin on the edge of the block. And there's a pin on the right and a pin on the left as well. So the pins are what on the edges are what we use to register the pattern. So in this case, she's already got 2 colors down. She's putting on the third block. She'll use the pins that were printed in the first 2 colors as her guide. Next slide. And this picture shows Dave doing the same thing, although he is putting the first color down. So he is lining up the pin, which you can see right by his fingers as well, on the edge of the paper. So with the first color, we use the edge of the paper as our guide for where to place the pins. Next slide is the final step is to set the block all the way down and move the bridge into place. So the bridge is the U-shaped piece of metal that attaches overhead to the foot pedal. So we press down on the foot pedal, it transfers the pressure to the block and makes our impression. So the bigger the block and the more the surface area, the harder you need to jump. So this is a big block that has a lot of surface area, so we have to jump. Sometimes you just have to press lightly. Every block is different, and we warm up at the beginning. That's sort of how we figure out how much pressure, where to put the bridge, how much paint, etc. Next slide. And then we lift it up. And one thing I will say, I've talked a lot about our process. There's lots and lots that goes behind getting ready to make a print. But one of the most gratifying things about being a printer is that once all that has been put into place, you make your print and voila, it's all there at once. It's very immediate. It's not like painstakingly creating a drawing or a painting. Next slide. And then we hang them up to dry. Next slide is that as well. Jack hanging up a paper. And then the next slide. This shows the process of, each color requires a separate set of blocks and a separate turn on the press. So I printed this one last week. I thought I'd snap a couple photos. On the left is just the first color, the brown dots. In the center, we add on the second block, which is the blue with the wheel, and then the third is a lighter blue highlight photo, so you can see how the patterns build on each other. And I see that we're at 12:52, so I'm going to go kind of quickly through the next few slides, which are about some of the special processes that we do. So in the beginning, I mentioned that sometimes papers were flocked with chopped wool, which is applied to a sticky, instead of printing with paint, you print with a sticky varnish. So this is an example of a flocked paper. They were often tone on tone. Next slide. This is the wall. Originally, they were actually carpet trimmings, or it was usually a waste product that was used to create the flock. That's not available to us, so we have hand dyed yarn to our specifications and then chop it into tiny pieces. Next slide. And this is a picture showing flocking happening. The printer is applying the sticky varnish, and the paper goes into a trough, which has the flock in the trough, and then a soft bottom, and the child labor is beating underneath to put the flock into the air um, and have it land on the paper and stick. Next slide. So that's how it was done, and this is what it looks like when we do it. Thankfully, we're all adults and we're taking safety precautions not to breathe the flock or the varnishing. Next slide. This is an example of a flocked paper before the original that we worked from, and then the next slide shows our result. And then the next slide. This is a process called irisé printing. It's a blended technique. I think we'll skip over. You could have a irisé printing, such as in this, and then in the next slide shows both irisé printing and the next, sorry, irisé printing and an irisé ground, which is an even more involved technique. Next slide. So here's a before and after that we did for the Homewood Museum at Johns Hopkins. It's an arabesque. You can see the fantastical figures and the birds like I was talking to you about. I have another before and after in the next slide. It's immensely satisfying to be able to take these worn artifacts from the past, piece them together like a puzzle, faithfully copy every elegant or quirky detail, and bring them back to life. Next slide. So to have them go from what you see on the left to what you see on the right. A mangy looking pile of scraps dropped off at our shop to an integral part of an authentic period decor. Next slide. And here we all are. And that's that. I hope this was an informative talk. And if anybody has questions, they could put them in the chat and I'll do my best.
That's great. Thank you.
The question is, what is the sticky varnish? The sticky varnish is Damar varnish. Steve is our master paint maker, so I can't tell you everything that goes into it, but Damar crystals and dryer. So it's an oil-based varnish that was traditionally used.
If you're looking, someone asked, when you apply the paint colors, are you generally going dark to light?
Oh, that's a good question. Yes, when we apply the paint colors, the most important thing is that we're going from the largest areas of detail to the finest detail. So, but also as a general rule, it will go from dark to light. The lighter colors, it's hard to put it's hard to put a very light paint on a very dark ground, and it's not so hard to put a very dark paint on a light ground. But in general, if I had to give you an order, I would say we would go from medium toned, slightly darker, darkest, and then lightest.
Someone said, stunning, makes me wish I lived closer, always enjoy your Instagram posting, which does make me wonder. So do you guys, do you work nationally? Do you work mainly locally? Do you work internationally?
Oh, and in terms of with we work and ship all over the world. So we've done a couple of projects in England, that very fancy Arizea I showed you right towards the end. Went to a home in Ireland. Um, some of the Gothics I was showing you were for a historic home in Canada. Uh, Mostly, projects are in the United States, and most of our orders are in the United States as well. Um, but um, all all over, yeah.
Yeah. Since you have to make essentially custom blocks each time you make this, do you keep those so the people who order the wallpaper get to keep the blocks? How does that work?
Um, that is kind of on an individual basis. So um, often, oftentimes we do keep them, and we add them to our line and reproduce them. Sometimes that is with a licensing agreement with the institution that originally commissioned the paper. So that's nice for them. They get a small royalty every time we sell that paper again. Sometimes there's no licensing agreement. Sometimes um, the client will want a paper, and they might have rules in their own institution that say we can't reproduce it. So we've reproduced a couple of papers for the White House and for the New York State parks. And in both those cases, and probably some others, we are not allowed to reproduce or sell those. Sometimes historic homes will want a paper, and we don't add it to our line just because we don't think it's gonna be all that popular for private clients. So it's really just sort of on a case by case basis.
Someone says, do you work with historic sites in Natchez, is that Mississippi? I'm aware that some owners who live in grand houses there were looking to restore wallpaper in their home. The house is evergreen.
Sure. I mean, I would encourage anybody who is wanting to reproduce a paper to contact us. A lot of times we'll get inquiries. People have a paper, they want it reproduced. They're not quite sure of the time period. We can probably help to date that, and let you know if it's something we can or cannot do. A lot of times people will have a paper that's been up for a very long time. They're not sure the date. They reach out to us, and we can determine that it's actually a roller printed paper, and probably not something that we're able to reproduce with our technology. But 1840 and before, those are generally block printed, and we usually can reproduce them.
That might slightly help explain the next question. Someone says, can you compare your process with screen printed papers such as made by Bradbury and Bradbury?
Well, I don't know myself, don't know all that much about screen printing. I know they use a different, what we use is paint, and what they use is ink. I think a lot of times printing inks are oil-based. Screen printing is done on a big long table where you move the screen, rather than on a press or bench where the paper moves. I think that you can probably get larger repeats on a screen printed with screen printing. Those are the things that come to mind most quickly for me.
Well, it is after 1 and I don't see any other questions. So thank you very much for joining us today, everyone. Thank you very much, Michelle. Thank you, Adelphi. This has been fantastic. This is very interesting. As I said, this has been recorded. It will be available on our YouTube channel along with all of our other preservation school classes and a lot of other content. So please go do check that out and check out our website, hdc.org, if you want any more information about upcoming events or anything else that we are doing.
And yeah, I would just like to thank you everyone for your interest. And thank you, Michelle, for helping me with my slides.
You're very welcome. Sorry, there were some technical issues, but we got it figured out.
Yes, we did. Thank you. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, everyone. Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.